Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the regular monthly meeting of the Greenwich Board of Estimate and Taxation. This time, please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the regular monthly meeting. There are copies of the meeting's agenda and the materials for consideration of the board on the table to the right over here. Before we begin, I want to recognize that our controller, Peter Mrynarski, is not with us this evening. He had undergone some surgery last week, and he is doing fine and resting. I believe he was in the office today. He walked over, so he's doing much better. I did send him a get well bouquet of fruit, actually, not flowers, something edible, on behalf of the board, and I know he looks forward to returning back to his job here at the town. I also want to thank those who were kind enough to send their prayers to my wife and I as our infant daughter was in the hospital for several days. She's doing much better now, and I want to thank those who were supportive and kept us in their prayers. Thank you. At this time, I'd call upon the board clerk, Ms. Rutgers, to read the routine applications.
We have 11 routine applications this evening. GL1, Greenwich Library, to continue enforce or to carry into the next fiscal year $26,000 for a radio frequency identification book return automation project at the Byram Schubert Library. GM3, this is on the agenda as discussion of GEM's budget, but it is actually release of the first half payment to GEMS for the fiscal year 07-08. Which which they're required to do twice a year. HD6, Health Department, approval to use $20,457 for regular salaries. It's to accept a state grant payment for public health emergency preparedness. PD10, the Police Department, approval to use $7,500 from the state of Connecticut for an expanded DUI enforcement program. PD11, Police Department, approval to use $18,375 from the state of Connecticut for Memorial Day, July 4th DUI enforcement. PW4, Department of Public Works, to carry over into the next budget year $250,000 for work on the skating rink. PW5, to carry over into the next budget year $2,200,000 for the Glenville Fire Station rehabilitation. PW6, Department of Public Works, a transfer of $110,000 to cover salary shortfalls due to unreimbursed retirement payments. PW8, Department of Public Works, to carry over into the next budget year $250,000 for storm drains. PW9, Department of Public Works, to carry over into the next budget year $234,000 for the Kennedy Garage Sewer Pump Station. And PW10, Department of Public Works, to carry over into the next budget year $40,000 to complete the project for the exit road gate at Holly Hill. And I move these 11 routine applications.
Moved by Ms. Rutgers. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Walko. Any discussion? Not all in favor?
Aye.
Under non-routine applications, we essentially are carrying over from, I guess, the special meeting discussion and action on a proposed resolution for the North Miami Sewer Project cost certification. For those who may not be familiar with it, the controller has to certify the costs of these projects. There has been considerable discussion and publicity about the costs and what should be charged to the project, what should not be. An audit was conducted by an outside firm. There had been negotiations or discussions with town administration as to which costs were appropriately charged to the project. And to date, the controller has not certified a cost for this project and needs to do so relatively shortly, in the fact that the Condemnation Commission will assign each benefited homeowner their costs, which they begin to pay. So we are involved because we're looking to give some guidance and direction to the controller who wants to take this next step. This evening we have with us Gene McLaughlin from the Town Attorney's Office, who will certainly lend to the discussion and provide some needed legal counsel. And we have with us the First Selectman, Jim Lash, who is here representing the town administration and can speak to us about how we got to where we are today and what options are before us. So at this time, I'd ask Mr. Lash to lead off.
Good evening. Let me rehearse the history of this for you for a couple of minutes, and then we can talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. The project started back about 6 years ago. Mr. Madrid was then the Public Works Commissioner, and Mr. Madrid and the Health Department believed that it was important to sewer the North Miami District because it's a ledgy, rocky area, and people's septic systems were failing. They went out to bid, selected a contractor. That contractor failed to perform. Then First Selectman Mr. Bergstresser decided, after a good deal of looking at the facts and consulting with the town attorney's office, to pay the contractor $250,000 to get rid of them and put the project back out to bid. The contract was awarded to the firm that was doing the other part of the North Miami project, and they proceeded to complete the project ahead of schedule for the cost that they had promised, and without the sorts of difficulties that the first contractor had. So the project was completed. There was then a process of conversation that started with Mr. Madrid and eventually carried on after I became First Selectman with the town administrator, Mr. Gomo, with regard to a range of issues. The kinds of issues that were being discussed were things like, does someone who has a perfectly good system have to abandon that system and hook up to the sewer line? How much time do people have to hook up? Can some people wait to hook up until they are actually selling their property? And there were a number of these issues, and they were worked out and compromised along the way, and those decisions were documented on the town website and in documents. The one issue that remained throughout all of this was the question of what cost would be certified for the project, what started out as a small group of people and devolved basically into one person with whom I think some of you met, Mr. Schulman, negotiated with the town attorney, negotiated with the town administrator over what costs might have been incurred which should not have been charged to the project. Mr. Madrid, as Public Works Commissioner, had a very clear view. Remember, at this time he'd been Public Works Commissioner for probably 7 or 8 years. He had a very clear view of what his powers and authorities were under the charter, and he took a number of actions. Also, during the course of the project, there was a request from a small neighborhood that was not originally to be included in the plan to have them included in the plan. And so he executed the project as he saw that it should be executed. I and the town administrator agreed with Mr. Schulman that we would have a third party conduct an audit of the costs to see if any of the costs which were charged to the project should not have been. The conclusion that the outside auditor came to in a report that I believe you received was that about $214,000, $215,000 of those costs probably should not have been allocated to that roughly $20 million project. And Mr. Gomo then went back into negotiation with Mr. Schulman over the final number to be certified. At the time, as I recall, they homeowners in the area were suggesting that $1.2 million or $1.3 million should be taken out of the cost of the project. This went back and forth for quite a while. We weren't at that point agreeing on specific items, but rather trying to compromise the amount in the way negotiations sometimes do. And in the end, they came to the conclusion that, for the purpose of settling the dispute, that we would recommend to the town that we take $600,000 off the cost as opposed to only the $215,000 or $214,000 that had been certified by the auditor. And so we did that. And that brings us, I think, to where we are today. We have perhaps three viable alternatives. The simplest alternative is for the controller acting on his own authority under the charter to certify an amount that he believes is appropriate. Probably the most defensible amount he could certify in that case would be the project costs as accumulated, less the $214,000 or $215,000 that the auditor said he thought probably should not have been included in the cost of the project. You could argue about it, but that was his professional opinion. That would be one solution. The second solution would be what was brought to you a few weeks ago, which is to have the $600,000 discount, if you will, off the accumulated cost be approved by the Board of Estimate and the RTM, and in effect as if it were an appropriation, the RTM acting in its role as the sole representative of all the people in the town, and that would be a second way of dealing with it. And you could probably come to a third alternative, which would be for the BET to say, no, we view this as the settlement of a claim, in which case the $600,000 would go to the Board of Selectmen. The Board of Selectmen would either agree or not. If we don't, it's the end of that conversation. If we do, and we've not taken this item up, then it would go back to you for an appropriation and to the RTM Claims Committee, and only if both of those bodies approved the item would that then become the amount that the controller would then certify, and that would send it on to the Condemnation Commission. Those are roughly the three alternatives we have in front of us. The recommendation that Mr. Gomo had made and that I had made to you was that we treat it as an appropriation, have you approve it, have the RTM approve it. But obviously that didn't meet with immediate unanimous approval from the BET, or we wouldn't be standing here now. So I think that brings us to where we are. It seems to me those are the three alternatives that we have available. Obviously we could create others, but those seem to me to be the three. I'd be happy to try to answer questions if I can. I will say that I was never in the negotiations myself. It was always Mr. Gomo, so I may not be able to give you anything other than hearsay as to what actually transpired in those meetings. But Mr. Gomo and I did talk about how he was proceeding and how we would approach the subject.
Before you take questions, I just want to do two things. One, acknowledge Mr. Schulman, you're here. Thank you for being here. Spoke today. And Mr. Perry, you're here as well. And also, Mr. McLaughlin, if it's appropriate at this time, can you touch upon the three options that Mr. Lash has outlined and just confirm that those meet with all the necessary criteria that, or confirm what criteria would be followed? I know you were in touch with bond counsel, and there may be need to shed some light on that as well.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of Estimate. My name is Gene McLaughlin, Assistant Town Attorney. I'll just run through, as the First Selectman has outlined, the three options and just make legal comments. The first option, which is the controller to certify the amount, would only require action by the controller under the charter. He certifies the total amount of construction to the Condemnation Commission. The Condemnation Commission then uses that figure to determine what the assessment, the total assessment is that the Condemnation Commission is then to divide up amongst the affected properties that are benefited by the project. And the amount that was mentioned was $214,000, which is entirely supportable by the documentation that you have from the audit. The second option, which is the $600,000 reduction in the amount of the assessment that would be put on the affected property owners, that would require, as the First Selectman has said, both Board of Estimate and Taxation approval and representative town meeting approval. That particular course of action has been reviewed in detail with the bond counsel, who went into a detailed resolution that would be sent by this board to the Board of Estimate and Taxation. The third option, which is the settlement of a claim, does follow the usual path of the Board of Selectmen. It is empowered under the general statutes to settle claims against the town. However, the appropriation for that has to be approved by this body. The Board of Estimate and Taxation, and since it would be over $5,000, would also require the representative town meeting claims committee. This would be somewhat unique, however, in that we don't actually have a lawsuit pending, and there would have to be obviously some details worked out. Normally, in a claim, you have either a stipulated judgment and a release of all claims. Also, in this particular procedure, the property owners of the affected properties that would be assessed would have a right that I don't think should be foreclosed to go before the Condemnation Commission and appeal their particular assessments as they relate to the whole. In other words, if a particular property owner feels that the amount of assessment that's put on his or her property is too large, they have a right to go before the Condemnation Commission and say this is too much based on the benefit that my property would acquire. And that person also has a right to appeal from the Condemnation Commission to the Superior Court. But I think you're talking in more of a global type of thing here, that the overall claim by affected property owners as to the total amount of the cost that's attributable to their properties would have to be settled in some way. So there are some challenges here, but it could be something that can be worked out. So those would be the legal parameters of what we're talking about. Are there any questions?
Did you have Mr. Walko?
I was just going to report briefly on the Budget Committee's analysis of this. I know it was deemed out of order by the Law Department, but I think it's important just to put on the record that we did consider this. The Budget Committee did take a stab at this, and since that time has been deemed out of order. But just to give the vote, it was 3-0-1 with Mr. Mason abstaining due to either a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest, and that was to do an accounting of the project as a sub-account or a theoretical sub-account of the sewer improvement fund, and we had come up with a number of 461, I think it's 332, by advice of counsel. That is not a permissible number based upon the calculations that were made and the assumptions and the allocation of interest. And so that is why I did not propose, and it is why you did not recognize me to start this presentation and propose on behalf of the Budget Committee the 461 on behalf of the Budget Committee. So I just want to make sure that that was noted.
If you want me to comment on that, Mr. Chairman,
Certainly.
that is correct. The approach was quite imaginative and a way to resolve this. We did take a look at it, and there are provisions in the Sewer Act that provide that all the money, including interest on the bonds and notes, goes into the Sewer Improvement Fund, and there are difficulties then trying to get it out of the Sewer Improvement Fund, as was contemplated, to try to be an offset to the cost.
Mr. Simon?
So I read that said there you couldn't allocate out the interest earned. What is the town's position or ability to charge interest on the money it advanced, to pay the interest and the principal for the last 5 years.
I don't think it's directly addressed in the charter. However, the cost that the controller is required to certify to the Condemnation Commission is supposed to include the interest on the bonds up to the date of the first day of payment. So the cost is definitely a certifiable cost that the town has to pay the interest on the notes. However, there's another section of the charter that says all interest on the proceeds from the bonds is supposed to go into the sewer improvement fund. And to
Right,
get,
but that part I got,
yes.
which would be in our calculations, the 615, but we've essentially advanced to the property owners $3.8 million. And are we entitled to collect interest on that?
If it's part of the total cost as certified by the controller, for example, is it part of the bond proceeds? Or the bond interest on the bonds and the notes?
The town has paid back on the bonds principal and interest for the last 5 years out of its own general fund.
Yes. So that would be included as a cost, I would think.
We would be able to at least have a discussion of that 368,000.
I think so. Well, I think what the procedure is for the controller to review all the costs, the construction costs, costs associated with procurement of properties, if that was one, the engineering, the incidental certifiable costs to the project, and also the interest on any funds that have been paid specifically for the notes, interest on the notes. And once he examines all those and determines the total cost, then that's what he certifies. Now, whether or not, I don't know, I can't speak for the controller without reviewing it specifically and discussing it with him, but that would be something he would have to certify in the first place, that it would be includable.
Mr. Stone?
Just to put a fine point on this, Mr. McLaughlin, would you say it's normal for the town to be charging to the, let's call it the benefited area, the pro rata share of the interest cost that has been accruing?
I would say yes, on initial.
Okay.
Yes.
So any deviation from that is clearly a marked change, and it would be in return for some perceived benefit by the town.
I'm not sure I'm following you completely, but I would look, first of all, I would discuss this with the controller to see what his normal procedure was. Mm-hmm. And I would also look to whatever procedure was followed in the more recent Millbrook. In other words, if what you're talking about is a cost and an expense that the controller certified in that case to the total certifiable cost to Millbrook, that would certainly be a guide if we had any question about whether it should be included or not.
Somebody is paying the interest, obviously.
Yes. Yes.
And obviously the controller is not here this evening, but we can, based on what you've said, make some sort of an assumption that normally that's for the account of the benefited property owners.
I would say.
Mr. McLaughlin, I think Mr. Geiger can answer that.
In terms of how Millbrook was calculated?
Yes.
It was interest on the principal.
Charged to the
Charged to the
Benefit.
property owners.
from the date of sale of the bonds, I assume.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that answers that.
Thank you.
Can we just clarify that? Did we charge them money we advanced, interest on the money we advanced them, Millbrook,
On the principal.
and not the interest? Which would be a subset of the 368, the 368,000. So what we proposed here is inconsistent with what we did with Millbrook.
Further questions for Mr. McLaughlin? Mr. Walko?
Questions or comments?
Either way, yeah.
I think the Budget Committee took a stab at this in trying to recognize and try to give benefit to the homeowners for what we thought was the actual cost of the project, and that's the exercise that we went through with the budget, with the finance department, in an attempt to capture the cost. I think from our standpoint, the one justifiable number pursuant to the auditor's report was the 215, but I think we also recognized the negotiation on behalf of the town and the group of homeowners there, recognizing that there were issues with this project. In light of the town attorney's position that number is out of order, and I'm now speaking personally, not chairman as the budget committee or on behalf of the budget committee, I would move that we ask, I guess it's directing the comptroller, and I'm looking at Mr. Geiger because he's sitting in his shoes, to bring this back to us through the town process as a claim, because I see it as more of a claim than I do as a definitive number. I see this as the potential to, quote unquote, avoid litigation, and I think we should have more than just an auditor's report that seems to suggest some other number. And so I would move, and we wouldn't lose any time on this, but I think all it would do is go through a process where if the public would be able to speak. I know there's been criticism that the Seward area has not had a chance or an opportunity to speak on this, and it would go through the process. It still needs to go before the RTM, as the town attorney said, and so this would be, I think, a more normal process by which to adjudicate and resolve this matter. So I move that this be brought back before us in the form of a resolution of a claim, as opposed to, I'm not even sure it's an appropriation. There's no blue sheet. There's no documentation. So that's the justification for my motion.
Is there a second to it? Seconded by Mr. Norton. And discussion, I have questions about it. In terms of bringing it back, it would come back before us, and we certainly can take comment from the public on it. But with the RTM, it would be limited to just the segment of the Claims Committee, which is a very, narrow group. Whereas if it were to be before us as just an appropriation for the $600,000, the full RTM would have a chance to solicit and hear from the public. So in terms of broadening the debate, I think I see that as a distinction. And my other question for the town attorney is, I think I heard you say that we really don't have a claim yet. Would you categorize this as threatened claim or pending litigation? I mean, I guess my question is, how do you really categorize something that isn't routinely? This is not something I recall seeing ever.
It's unique. And I think the challenge would be to, even though there isn't a claim, there's a recognizable claim out there. I think the challenge would be to try to treat it as a claim and fully resolve it. I'm not sure how many property owners or releases we would have to get if there's an alternative to that. But it's a challenge, but certainly something we can study to see how we can, even though at this end there may not be a claim, I think what you really want at the opposite end is a full resolution of it, if that can be achieved. So we can certainly work on it.
Mr. Krummick?
This is not a claim, and we're not settling a litigation. We discussed this at the special meeting, but it bears repeating that what we have here is an informal negotiation between some neighbors and the First Selectman's office in the person of the town administrator to try to come to a negotiated solution, a reasonable allocation of costs. And it's not binding on anyone. It doesn't actually settle any litigation. It doesn't even cut off the prospect of litigation, because each of the homeowners, as I understand it, could challenge the assessment.
it's more along the lines of a negotiation of what a reasonable allocation of costs would be on the project. And in fact, my understanding from the controller at the special meeting is he accepts that as a reasonable allocation of cost. And perhaps the real way to regard this is not as an appropriation, but really as a resolution or a resolution supporting the comptroller's determination that, in fact, that $600,000 negotiated figure, which includes the $214,939 recognized by the audit report and an additional amount negotiated by the town administrator, as a reasonable means for resolving, for fairly allocating the costs. And if the comptroller certifies that that's the end of the process, I think all we're called on to do is to give him some comfort and a resolution that would support that approach. But it's certainly not a claim. It's not set up for a claims committee, and I think that you don't want to bastardize that process by making this go through that.
Thank you, Mr. Crumick. Are there any comments on the motion by Mr. Walko and Mr. Norton? Mr. Stone.
I just want to get clarification. I think there's been a lot of inference, but to make certain, absolutely, as certain as we possibly can, that the first selectman is recommending the $600,000 amount.
Mr. Lash is, yes. The answer to your question is he is recommending the $600,000. Mr. Simon?
There was, I think Mr. Lash made a comment that the claim would be put back into the expense of the homeowners. Someone said that if we went through the process, the claim would then go back in as an expense, or this would be paid from, who would pay the claim? Would come out of the general fund, the risk fund? Would be.
If we were to go to the root of the claim, we're...
I don't think I said anything about where the $600,000 would come from. If I did, I didn't mean to.
Well, I assume the claim would be the difference between the 215 and the 600. Maybe not.
Well, think about it this way. We spent the full $16, $17 million doing the project. If we decide to charge the benefited homeowners for less than that, the difference has to come from somewhere.
Right.
Because the charge resides in the sewer improvement fund, we would have to reimburse the sewer improvement fund, either by billing all the sewer users or by charging the general fund or some combination of the two.
Right, I think that was the part I misunderstood.
I don't think there's been any discussion about how that would be handled so far.
I think I misunderstood all the sewer users as to being the affected sewer users, which is different population.
I was probably unintentionally ambiguous.
You're very kind.
Sometimes I'm intentionally ambiguous. That wasn't one of them.
So I am actually now willing not to go down this path of the claims, but support the original proposal for the $600,000. And I think, though, that this is a reasonable estimate by the controller as to what the costs are in his best judgment. I think he should take his methodology and follow what we did at Millbrook and charge interest on the principal in a manner similar to what we did at Millbrook and consistent with past practices, and proceed. That would be my recommendation. We have a motion on the table.
We do have the Walko-Norton motion. Does anyone have other comments on it? One point of clarification, at least to make sure I'm on the same page. I agree with what Mr. Crumick said in terms of what it is we are doing and what we're not doing. And Ed, maybe you can clarify. We're voting, in a sense, to give the controller the go-ahead in terms of certification. We're not getting into the actual calculation of the total cost because we don't know. Is that?
Well, my understanding, and maybe it was from the special meeting, is that what we were asked to do then is to pass a resolution advising the controller that, that we agree with that method of allocating funds, and that, which is to recognize the negotiated $600,000 allocation of costs that had been negotiated by the town administrator, and that the controller was prepared to certify as an appropriate and reasonable allocation of costs. And then the second thing that we had discussed at the special meeting, addressing the point that Jim made, is that we thought that the difference should be paid for out of the general fund over a period of time to reimburse the improvement fund, because really it's the cost of it's the effect of allocating or not allocating the difference to the specific affected sewer owners. So that's what I thought we were called on to do at the special meeting. We couldn't reach agreement on that. So an alternative to Mr. Walco's motion, if you vote against treating this like a claim, I think the alternative would be to propose a resolution to the comptroller, and the comptroller, if he agreed that that's a reasonable allocation, would just certify the amounts. It would never have to go anywhere other than the comptroller's certification.
I think that's right. I think if, in theory, you wouldn't have to vote at all. The controller, under the charter, I shouldn't practice law with Gene here, but I often do, can certify the cost that he believes is the most accurate in the end.
Okay, so the discussion, thank you, Mr. Crumick. The discussion is still on the Walco-Norton motion, and you asked to be recognized, Mr. Walco.
On that point, though, my understanding from the law department is if it is the 600 that we're talking about, it does need to go to the RTM.
Well, with respect to the law department, I think what the charter says is that the controller decides what the cost of the project was to be allocated to the benefited property owners.
That's right.
Now, he could look for as much cover as he wants.
The 600,000, which is, I think, alternative 3, I think contemplated that was an amount
Right. But if he certifies it, he certifies it. And I presume he's allowed to exercise some reasonable discretion in that process.
Yes.
Probably not to the extent of $8 or $10 million.
Right. Some of these issues get into claims that can be made, and may want to consider going to executive session on some of the aspects of that.
Right. Well, we have a motion on the floor, so we need to dispose of that. Mr. Finger, or excuse me, Mr. Walco, and then Mr. Finger.
So I just had before that, to Mr. Simon's point, I didn't quite understand if we follow the same process as we did in Millbrook, how voting for the 600 is part of that same process, when in Millbrook, where the justification is between the 200 and the 600, or the 215 and the 600. So I would argue immediately, right off the bat, you're having a different process. My last point on this is if in fact we're not going to treat this as a claim, and if in fact the comptroller is going to certify this for 600, then as a matter of process, and if he has the right to do that without RTM approval, then we should take no action on this. Because in my estimation, then taking action on it, even in support of the comptroller, only validates the fact that arguably he doesn't have the authority to certify the 600. I would say then if the normal process is for the comptroller to certify 600, and if that's the number he's comfortable with, that's what should happen, and this body should not do anything that it didn't do in Millbrook, which is to not affirm what the comptroller has done in certifying costs.
And I think Mr. McLaughlin's subtle point earlier was that at some point you just don't want to keep putting speculation on the record.
Okay, so Mr. Finger, I recognize you next.
I do not support approaching this as a claim. If I recall at our special meeting, Mr. Schulman made it perfectly clear on a number of occasions that while he was in these meetings with Mr. Gomo and trying to reach a negotiated agreement, he did state that he did not represent any formal group. So not only do we have the problem of there not being an actual claim, we're going to struggle to find who it is that we're going to create as making that claim. And I just think it's fraught with all kinds of potential potholes and roadblocks, and it might be overly complex for what, at the end of the day, we're inclined to do, maybe inclined to do.
Thank you. Ms. Rucker?
No, I would agree with Mr. Finger. It seems to me the whole approach in these negotiations was to come to something where there would be a consensus, even though there was no legally represented body. It was a matter of coming to some consensus, and by going the claims route, as is in the motion that Mr. Wolko has just put on the table, we're doing exactly the opposite of what it seemed to me the purpose of the whole negotiations was, and to avoid litigation. If you're, going to try and seek out a group that might litigate, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Okay, further comments? If not, those in favor, Ms. Barton.
Before we vote, could we hear the pending motion restated, please?
You want to?
You want me to restate it?
Restate your motion.
I just want to be sure we know what we're voting, yes or no.
It was to ask the town, through the comptroller, to bring this back to us in the form of a claim. After going through the normal process as a claim was the underlying purpose to it.
So if everyone's clear, we can do this by a show of hands. Those in favor of the Walco-Norton motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed? And abstentions? Ms. Zimbrowski, do you have it down? Okay, that is not carried, and we'll proceed. Ms. Barton.
I have an alternative suggestion.
Okay.
Which would be to move to, in effect, send this matter back to the controller, who should consult with the town attorney in determining how to proceed, and either take action himself or come back to us at our July meeting and report why he can't.
Okay, that's a motion from Ms. Barton. Is there a second to that? Mr. Himes? It's been moved by Ms. Barton, seconded by Mr. Himes. Discussion on that? Mr. Crumick?
I think that I think that the idea behind it is the correct one, because I must say that I believe that it is with the controller. Controller has discretion to certify this as a reasonable allocation of costs on the project. The one benefit that I saw of our making a resolution that basically agrees with the $600,000 allocation negotiated by the town administrator that the controller indicated he would agree with as well, is that it gives some action by this body that could be brought back to the homeowners and say, look, we've agreed to do this deal. I think that Steve's point, though, that really if it belongs with the controller, anything that we would do is superfluous, is a good one. that if that's what we think, that it should be part of the certification process of the controller, and that no action is needed by our board, that is what we should do. But I think that Nancy's motion is simply to do that, to put it back in the comptroller's lap where I think it belongs, and having spoken through it, I do support her motion.
Great, thank you. Mr. Stone?
Would you accept an amendment to include the first selectman or the office of the first selectman as well in that group to meet?
I would think the controller can talk to whoever the controller needs to talk to.
Well, it's not a question of talking to, I'd say reaching consensus. You focused on the controller reaching agreement with the town attorney. And we've had here certainly months and longer of the Office of the First Selectman being deeply involved in this. I see no reason to remove them from this exercise at this stage of the game.
I would ask for advice of counsel on that one. Jean, is it appropriate?
Yeah, I think it'd be fine. I think it's just recognizing the fact that a lot of negotiations going on ahead of this. So it's in order.
So the question is to you.
So to move to send the matter back to the controller to consult with the First Selectman's office and the town attorney in determining how to proceed.
Correct.
And report back to us in July
Right.
as to what they either have done or can't do,
Or should do.
or should do. I'm fine with that.
Comments, Ms. Rutgers?
I would be in favor of this motion. I have no problem with the amendment, but I just wanted to say that, as Mr. McLaughlin just said, there have been a lot of negotiations already preceding this, and in fact, at the special meeting, the comptroller said he could go with either number, the 215 or the 600. It doesn't seem to me like this is going to be like a huge negotiation with the first selectman and the town attorney, but I would think the comptroller could talk to whoever and get as much information as he wants to be comfortable about certifying a number.
Right, thank you. Mr. Walko? On the amendment?
On the amendment or on the motion?
On the motion, excuse me, the motion.
Because Nancy accepted the amendment,
Yeah.
so we're not voting.
So I just don't see what's going to happen while the comptroller's out there. I know Mr. Schulman personally has been here twice before us. I'm sure a lot of people have had conversations with some of the affected homeowners, and I think at some point we need to have resolution on this. And I just don't understand what the dialogue will be between the comptroller, the first selectman, and the law department will be on this. I think either we take this matter up tonight, or we don't, because we don't have to, and we leave it in the capable hands of the comptroller to make a determination.
Well, I think what was accomplished tonight was, one, that Mr. Lash is in fact said publicly, and I was not at the special meeting, but that he does support the $600,000 reduction going forward, in that council has advised that the controller has within his authority the ability to certify that, and I suspect, given that's been affirmed, Mr. Minarski, as soon as he's back from medical leave, will see to it that he certifies that cost and report back to us. I mean, I see it as simply as that. Mr. Norton?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm not certain if I understand what this does other than delay the matter another month, this motion. I agree with Mr. Walco that I think the issue is before us and we should resolve it here tonight. If the controller has the authority, I think what we've gone through is a discussion of a process of whether or not we consider it through one method or another, and I think we voted down the method of having it as a claim, so that I don't understand what we're accomplishing by delaying it another month.
May I?
Yes, you, Mr. Lash.
I think what will happen is the controller will certify a cost for the project, and he'll do that as soon as he's able. There will be some conversation with my office and the town attorney's office about the dollar amount. But I think you can't certify tonight anyway. In any case, it's going to go back to the controller. I think, given that you've rejected one particular approach, I think probably what will happen is as soon as he's able, he'll do the work necessary to certify the project, and it will then move on to the Condemnation Commission. I think the time frame will be exactly the same.
Great, thank you. So are there further comments on the Bartenheim's motion? If not, again, by a show of hands, those in favor? Barton, Stone, Tessie, Rutgers, Crumick, Tarkington, Himes. Can't see, but opposed? Norton, Simon, Walco, Finger. And abstaining, Mason.
The best bipartisan tradition of the BET.
Let's be clear as to what we're expecting in a month. What will happen in 1 month from this motion?
I think that the controller, well, Mr. Lash, since this has been tossed back to you and you're going to be carrying the ball for a portion of it, you can.
Yeah, I think the most likely outcome is the controller will certify project cost. I think that's the most likely outcome. There's a small chance that he would conclude he couldn't certify the cost, which would leave us in a very interesting place, or that he would certainly would make it interesting for the benefited homeowners. I think that's not very likely. I think it's possible he would come back to the BET for some more guidance, but I suspect that won't happen. He's pretty familiar with the facts here.
Mr. Finger, do you have a question for Mr. Lash?
I'm reading into what you're saying. You're assuming he's going to certify the cost that would include the exclusion of the $600,000.
Well, I think it's certain that he will exclude the 215, but I don't presume to speak for him. But he is well aware of the calculations and judgments that went into the 600. So I know from conversation that that's a number that he understands, but I don't want to forecast what.
Is it fair to say that when he consults with you, you will remind him of the $600,000 number?
I'll still be supporting that number.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Just a question. So, again, process. The controller certifies this project cost absent the $600,000, and then it goes to the Condemnation Commission. There's no further action required on the part of any other entity. Is that correct? Well, and then my follow-up question related to the appropriation, if there's a necessity for an appropriation or to cover the costs or the $600,000, we would then be involved in that process. And Mr. Geiger, you probably can speak to that in terms of how we handle that.
Well, without jumping on Mr. Geiger, first off, we can't, sitting here tonight, know what the controller will certify. You've mentioned one number a couple of times, but I don't think we know what he'll certify. With regard to, let's suppose he just certifies the original cost less the 215, just to take a number that I don't think there's any controversy about. This question still would be, because the 215 was incurred in the sewer improvement fund, how that would be paid, and that's a subject we would take up in the normal course during the budget cycle. So I would be making recommendations as first selectman. The budget committee would be debating it. The full BET would eventually vote on it. In all the solutions, though, I would expect that the money would be repaid by somebody to the sewer improvement fund over the 20 years that it took to pay off the bond.
I guess that hits on what I was trying to get at. So any type of adjustment would be handled through the budget process, whether it be...
Whether it comes from general fund balance from the taxpayers.
Okay.
combination.
So there would be no interim item. That's really what I was trying to get at, that in terms of further action by this board on this subject prior to any budget process. Okay, that answered my question.
Right, it would be covered over the 20-year period.
Great, thank you. Mr. Schulman, I'm sorry, you did come here tonight. I called you to make you aware that we were taking this up, and in fairness to you, I think we should hear from you just so you get we have a sense of what your feelings are about.
I appreciate it. Just want to clarify a couple of things because you've taken care of a lot of the meat of this. Number one is it was indicated that I was the sole negotiator involved in this, and I was the sole representative involved in this, and that is not at all true. There was a group of 6 or 7 people who were involved in this, and another half dozen others along the way, so this was not me. This was a whole group of people. That's number one, and I can name them for you if you want, but they're pretty well known in town. Secondly, just so to give you some comfort, I'll repeat what I said at the special meeting. The audit that you saw, if you look at the data on that audit and relative to when all these discussions happened, that audit was the starting place. The point of that audit, that is not a project audit. That was an audit ordered to look at very specific items. And the purpose of that audit was to see whether those items, in fact, were costs of the project. Had nothing to do with policy, and nothing which the $250,000 for the McNamee buyout and questions regarding when paving in the town happened and that sort of thing. So to look at the project audit, Mr. Walco particularly, and say that's the audit for this entire project is not really an accurate picture of what happened. So that none of the policy decisions were addressed. That was the starting point at which Mr. Gomo and Mr. Kalm and I and the other people at the table sat down and said, okay, here's where we start. And we went from there through every project cost, every change order, every scrap of paper related to this project. So it was a whole long process involved. And third, just so you understand, we understand on the accounting on this, our understanding of this was the project cost is the project cost minus the agreement we thought we had, which was the $600,000, plus whatever interest accrues on the bond from day one. Now, whether the bond whether the assessments happen now or they happen in 2 years, doesn't really matter to us because either we're paying our money now or we're paying interest later. So, we understand that to us that's a non-issue. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's helpful. Thank you. So, if there's no other comments on that, we'll proceed to the next item of business. And I know we have a number of representatives from the Nathaniel Witherell here this evening. Mr. Kowaleski, welcome. And we'll call upon Mr. Walco from the Budget Committee.
Second non-routine item is NW4 Nathaniel Witherell transfer of $133,500. This is a revised request and obviously a non-routine application. I don't know if Mr. Ormsby, if you'd like to make a presentation on the new spreadsheet. And I so move the transfer on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Is there a second? Second. Seconded by Mr. Simon. Good evening, Mr. Ormsby.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the BET. As the chairman mentioned, I'm joined here this evening by 5 of my fellow directors, Patricia Burns, Chris Thurlow, Lloyd Bankson, Thomas Siccardi, and Paul Toretta. In addition, the staff of Nathaniel Witherell, who is here this evening, include Bill Kowaleski, our executive director, Ray Augustine, our director of finance, Jack Hornack, our facilities manager. Let me begin by reporting to you that the Town Building Committee for Nathaniel Witherell's renewal project, which was approved by the RTM on January 11th, met this morning for an initial organizational meeting. It elected a chairman, a vice chairman, a clerk, and established a very ambitious schedule of biweekly meetings. On behalf of the Nathaniel Witherell, we're pleased and excited with the caliber and the experience of the members of that committee. I would like to put in context the request for the fiscal 2007 budget adjustments, which you have before you. Our books are not finally closed for the month of May of '07, but based on our operating results for the 10 months ended April 30th, 2007, Nathaniel Witherell's expenditures, excluding capital items, have been $12,926,790, compared to a 10-month budget, again, of operating expenses of $13,904,193. That's a favorable variance of $977,403, or approximately 7% of our operating budget. For the same 10-month period, our revenues are $16,282,000 against a budget of $16,051,000, or again, a favorable variance of about 1.4%. Like all town departments, those budgets were prepared in the fall of 2005, submitted to the Finance Department on December 1 of 2005. But unlike other town departments, the Witherell functions 24/7, 365 days a year, with health safety issues requiring constant vigilance. We are operating antiquated mechanical systems in a facility which parts of which date back to 1933. Our staffing levels at the facilities management and maintenance levels are stretched very thin. We're asking tonight for budget adjustments of $133,500 for expense items which represent less than 1% of a total expense budget prepared more than 18 months ago. I wanted to comment specifically on two items which received particular attention from the BET's Budget Committee earlier this month. The first was our request to encumber $75,000 included in our '07 budget for air conditioning work in the kitchen and dishwashing areas. Those areas are presently served by 4 wall-mounted air conditioning units, 2 of which were installed in 1973, 2 of which were installed in 1992. They are simply inadequate for the task. They frequently break down. They are foreign-made, which makes obtaining replacement parts very difficult. Temperatures in those 2 areas, on occasion in the summertime, will exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We've attempted to address that issue this year with a more energy-efficient dishwashing unit, which throws off less heat, generates less heat, and also by adding reflective window tinting to the eastern windows of that area. But it is clear that a more substantive solution is necessary. And frankly, the press of other demands on our staff has simply prevented us from accomplishing this project in fiscal '07. We will address the required engineering and procurement early in fiscal '08. And under these circumstances, and upon the advice of your Budget Committee, our own Building Committee has determined to withdraw the request for encumbrance, and we expect to return to you promptly in fiscal '08 when we have a detailed plan of action. The second item I want to comment on is the requested transfer of $21,000 among or between object codes for the purchase of software, which is identified on your sheet as Razor's Edge. Nathaniel Witherell will use that software in future fundraising efforts. We'll use it to track our 250-plus volunteers who contribute their time and services to making our residents more comfortable. It lets us track their special aptitudes and skills and their past and proposed assignments. It's also those records, incidentally, are kept today in a 3-ring binder with manual entries. It also will provide a more efficient system for recording and retrieving detailed information on the particular needs and status of our 202 residents. We have staff at Nathaniel Witherell has undergone training over the last week in the use of Razor's Edge. That training, incidentally, was included in the $21,000 purchase price of the software. That training included Mary Bruce, who is our Director of Recreation. It included Lenore Caserta, who is Bill's Administrative Assistant. It included several of our hands-on trustees, as well as a young lady named Christina Tolan, who is our new Development Coordinator. That software is owned by Nathaniel Witherell. It will be maintained on the premises of Nathaniel Witherell, and we regard it as an investment which will improve the efficiency and operations of Nathaniel Witherell across the board. We incidentally obtained a $7,000 discount from its list price of $28,000 as a result of the timing of our order. Ms. Rutgers has told me that this is a subject which generated some discussion among yourselves a little bit earlier this evening. I want to, for that reason, bring you up to speed or tell you where we stand in terms of the fundraising activity. We have hired as a development coordinator, not a director of development, a young lady who has had experience in the accumulation of computer databases for the purpose of mapping out a prospective list of possible donors for an annual appeal, which we would hope to make in the fall of this year. It would also perform or represent the nucleus of a database which could be tapped into for a capital campaign at a future date, all of which would be intended and is reflected in the business plan that you've seen before to defray a significant part of the costs of Project Renew. I am here personally to apologize for having authorized the purchase of that equipment before this body had an opportunity to act on the requested funds transfer. And I wrongly assumed that the $75,000, which was included in our 07 budget and was described in materials submitted to both the Finance Department and the Budget Committee of the BET as establishment, quotes, establishment of development office, included the authority to purchase the equipment for that office. And I am still climbing the learning curve for municipal procedures, but I want to mention this specific item and hope that you would nevertheless approve this transfer in object codes, notwithstanding my having jumped the gun on its acquisition. I would propose to sit down and let you ask Bill Kowaleski, Ray Augustine, Jack Hornack, any specific questions you have on our request for budget adjustments, which aggregate $133,500, unless anybody has any questions of me.
Mr. Simon?
What's not clear at the moment is the relationship between the 501c3, which the town has no control over or authorization, and the town providing resources to the 501c3. And you use the word "we" too interchangeably.
Well, the town is not providing resources solely with respect to this particular item of software. The town is not providing software exclusively for the use of Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc.
But I would argue that Razor's Edge is primarily a fundraising package, and the town has never used it before for the reasons you've described.
Well, we have trained now Mary Bruce.
I understood everything you said, but I would argue that this is primarily a fundraising package and not for the reasons you described.
Well, I don't,
And so I'd like to know where the relationship is between what the town is expending and what the 501c3 is using. And that was an issue that we raised.
The 501c3 is led by the young lady I described. Her salary is being paid by the Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc., an independent organization. But her role is to create a computer database which will allow us to carry on the fundraising activities which are reflected in our business plan. I can talk to you about Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc., but it's an organization which...
You don't have to talk to me. I understand all of these issues. It's a very, my question, I think, is very simple. And I don't know if we got any further advice from the law department. I'm just concerned that we're paying people on the town payroll, possibly, and providing software to a 501c3, to which, really, from my point of view, the town has no knowledge of who's actually on the board of the 501c3, what the activities are, and has no control over where the money goes.
Let me say at the outset, and I thought I made it clear a moment ago, the town is not paying any employee of Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc. Her salary is being funded from Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc. Her check for the first 2 weeks was delivered last Friday. It's a check drawn on the modest funds of Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc.
There was, in the presentation last time, I believe, a director of development
That
that's on the town payroll. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct. We do not have a director of development. We've interviewed approximately 12 persons, no one of whom have we concluded has the right aptitudes or experience for this job. And we have hired a development coordinator, and it's an important distinction. She understands it. She is not the director of development. That development coordinator is being paid by Friends of Nathaniel Witherell, Inc.
Mr. Simon, are you through with your questions? Because there's other people who want to, other members. Great. Mr. Crumick.
Well, I think there have been precedents in the past where the town has fronted some money toward fundraising activities by a private group, and usually those expenditures are reimbursed. So if the town went out and purchased fundraising software for primary use by the 501c3, one way around it would be for it to be treated as a loan and have the 501c3 reimburse the town for that. And we recognize that the only purpose of the 501c3 is to raise funds for a town institution. There are some precedents. You might want to consult those, and maybe this is a minor, maybe not such a minor point. We're concerned about a precedent, obviously, but I think there are some precedents, again, where the town has loaned money or fronted money for this purpose, and then it's been reimbursed.
Well, again, Mr. Crumick, I think the point seems to be ignored, although I've tried to make it clear that this equipment is not used solely for fundraising at Nathaniel Witherell. It's taking over the volunteer activities, the records of 250-plus volunteers that we have at Nathaniel Witherell.
No, and I do recognize that this is new information that we didn't have at the time of the Budget Committee, that there were other uses of the software. Really, all I was addressing is the general point that Larry had raised with you, and which suggested that it wouldn't be a proper use of municipal funds. And I think that in the past, the way that's been handled sometimes has been for the town to advance the funds and then to be reimbursed for after the fundraising has started. Throw that out for whatever it's worth.
Mrs. Thurlow, the vice chairman of your board, is asked to be recognized.
Good evening. I am the liaison from the board of directors to the family council. And I took the training before he is here in town hall. one of the applications that it was my intention to use this. We have over 800 family members who are affiliated with our residents. We need to be in communication with them for various things such as flu prevention, what is happening during the construction period, what is happening with the latest legislation regarding Medicare Part B, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a vehicle now for being able to assemble all of that database, and it was my intention as one of my uses from the standpoint of a member of the Board of Directors to be able to use that to facilitate disseminating information. So, as Mr. Ormsby said, we have many different applications for this. It is definitely a program that can be used for fundraising, but primarily it is a program which collects information on all of our constituencies and lets us know what the relationships among them are so that we can keep that in one place. And as you know, we have very strict HIPAA rules that we have to be cognizant of. So I just wanted to illustrate that that was one of the ways that I personally would be using it from the standpoint of a board member.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful to have that. Mrs. Tarkington.
Yes, I'd like to say that this is a bit more complicated than perhaps we've all been talking about so far. In fact, Nathaniel Witherall has had two other 501c3s, one for more than a half a century and one for more than 3 decades. Both of those 501c3s have solicited funds from, patient families or from many other donors in the town of Greenwich over those many years, including one of these 501c3s, which has run the cafe and other kinds of facilities at Nathaniel Witherall. They've also, depending on which one you're talking about, they've also run the picnic, which many of us have attended, and other things. We, as a town, have never really looked at all the funds that are coming into the town and really funding parts of Nathaniel Witherall's budget that we haven't considered. So I think there are some issues here that when we appropriate money, it's fungible. When we appropriate $740,000 to the Bruce Museum, we really don't know where it's going. I think there's a governance issue here that's very broad. We have all different kinds of funds and so forth that this board deals with, and I think that the issue raised by Mr. Simon is very appropriate in terms of understanding it. But I don't necessarily agree with overspending an account, so I'm not totally, I think there are some issues here. But, I think that this was a de novo 501c3. We as a BET accepted a long-range plan that requires several $100,000 of fundraising each year, including this up-and-coming fiscal year that begins July 1. I do think the board, or the Witherall management, everyone together, probably jumped the gun a little bit in terms of moving ahead. They thought they were doing the right thing because they get concerned if they didn't get started on collecting the data for the fundraising. They couldn't meet the goal of the first year of the long-range plan. So I think that there are some issues here, but basically Witherall has had 2 501c3s. Anyone can go to GuideStar, see what they are. You can, click on them and corporate match or whatever you want to do as you can their new 501c3, Friends of Nathaniel Witherall. But it's a bit more complicated than just appears on this piece of paper that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are not further comments, Mr. Simon, questions?
Question on other areas that you didn't talk about, so now you may want to leave. On the MDI software.
I'll relinquish the microphone to Ray Augustine and Bill Kowaleski.
So my question on the software and the training was, if you didn't have money left over this year, how are you going to? Where did this fit into your overall plan of buying the software? How are you going to pay for it?
This is which software? That's the MDI software?
Yes.
Well, so far on a year-to-date basis, okay, overall, granted not in the proper object code, we are, through 10 months, $970,000 favorable in our spending to the
That's not,
appropriate.
my question is, normally if you buy software to run your accounting system, you have a plan to acquire it.
Okay.
It's not like you say, well, we have extra money and therefore we're going to buy modules that we never had a plan to use.
We have, Larry, been sitting down with the people in IT. We had Ed Gomo up at Nathaniel Witherall. We had Peter Monarski. We had Roland Geiger at Nathaniel Witherall, along with Bill Kolowski and myself. And we also had the representatives from MDI up at Nathaniel Witherall to talk about the software and how we would be moving forward with it. We did not put in next year's budget any dollars for an acquisition of software. It is something that is extremely, extremely important to us. And the reason being is that I am putting together financial statements off an appropriation statement that has to get adjusted by department and a number of other
I understand all
areas.
that. Let me rephrase the question. If the software is important to you and you know you needed these modules, why didn't you put it into the capital budget last winter?
I don't have an answer for that other than say that we weren't prepared to do that, to get it into the capital budget. As you're aware of, we are very, very looking at not only next year's budget, but we're also looking at making and achieving the long-range plan for the year 2008. And we had excess cash in this year's budget that we would not have next year, and we're out to make our long-range plan so that we can show that we are moving along.
I mean, my only concern, and it deals with this item and a couple of other items, is that it's like you end up the year with extra money and now you decide all the things you might want to buy with it without going through any long-term strategic planning on what you want to do with your accounting system in particular. I mean, I, in general, am very supportive of what you're doing as an institution and like to be supportive of what you're doing, particularly in the finance area. But I try to resist having people just take the money at the end of the year and just go on a shopping spree. Now, that's a little harsh, but, you know, especially with the accounting system, you would think you would say, well, we need these 5 modules to buy. This is our plan, and let's execute it.
We have been, Larry, over, I'm going to say probably 3-year time period, under at least 3 administrators, we have been talking about shortcomings to the operations of Nathaniel Witherall, such things as inventory control systems to control our cost, okay, such things as accounting for our labor, not just up at, as an example, nursing department, but down to a level of nursing floor, putting responsibility where it needs to better get our cost in line with industry standards. And I find the MUNIS system to work fine as a municipal system, but it doesn't allow us to be able to go out and achieve where we're going with the long-range plan at Nathaniel Witherall.
I understand all that. I don't dispute that you need this, but it's, and I don't want to say it anymore, and this will be my last sentence, you know, you should have a plan. It's not like at the end of June we have extra money, what should we buy, but we have a plan to implement the system, we have a plan to run enterprise accounting, here's all the modules we need, and this is it.
Mr. Walko?
Just a brief comment. The Budget Committee spent a considerable amount of time on this item, or the previous item, and I'll let my comments at that meeting stand. I don't think they need to be restated. I would say, though, that I appreciate the conversations that I've had since that meeting with Mr. Kowaleski, the comments by Mr. Ormsby, and also the revision to the application. And to that, notwithstanding the discussion at the Budget Committee level, that part is very much appreciated in terms of relooking at this and coming up with a revised application.
One thing, if I can say, Steve, is that we are, like I believe I briefly mentioned at the Budget Committee meeting, we are in very, very dynamic change within Nathaniel Witherall. And expenditures that may have been budgeted in one object code next year may not end up there. As an example, one of our items for $45,000 was a new vehicle for Nathaniel Witherall. We are looking at options of using TAG and any other type of transportation group that might be able to get our residents around and whoever else needs to get moved around, which will take it from where our driver would have been under a 5100 code, and it'll end up down in a 52,000 code. So what I'm saying is, coming into next year, that change is going to be dramatic, and there are many, many more items like that that we will have to come back next year on a quarterly basis, even though we don't have quarterly release to tell you this is where we stand. Also going to be items of volume-related issues, such as 14% is our Med-A census for next year. If that rate goes up to 17 and 18%, we're going to have an increase, which is not budgeted, in our 5100 accounts for our rehab services. We're going to have an increase in our medical costs from our pharmacy. We're going to have an increase in oxygen and lab costs. So these are items that are theoretically not budgeted above that 14% plateau. So we're going to have to keep not only our liaisons, but I think everybody here on a quarterly basis informed as far as where we stand and what are going to be some of the shortfalls. And some of these items we got into very, very simple things, such as we were looking at bringing in a contractor to service our lifts, and these lifts are pretty complex. They're currently serviced by our maintenance people. There is a possibility that we may have to outsource that, which throws that maintenance of equipment under a 5400 account. If I were to come to you in September, because I don't honestly know how many times one of our people had worked on a piece of equipment over the last 2 years, I couldn't even give you a good estimate of what that is. All I could say is we have a potential for that, and somewhere down the line we're going to have to acknowledge that, hey, it doesn't belong here, or I might even need an additional appropriation. But here again, our goal is to stay within the guidelines of the long-range plan.
If there aren't any other questions, we want to thank you and certainly the members of your board for appearing tonight. Your overall results, as you pointed out, Mr. Ormsby, in the very beginning, are very favorable and exemplary, and I think we commonly share and appreciate the efforts you and the members of your board are making in a very difficult area in terms of overseeing the nursing home. Mr. Kowaleski, thank you, and hopefully we'll have a good summer. So is there a motion to approve this transfer?
It was, but and then
Walko and Simon. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carries.
The next item before us, Mr. Chairman, PW 11, DPW, release of conditions, $331,000. This also is a revised application, although I don't believe we received a revised blue sheet on this one. The amount, you can just note that the amount was changed to 331 to accurately reflect the subject release that was placed on the 08 budget. I so move on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Moved by Mr. Walko, second. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? No, we have Mr. Hubbs and Mr. Garabedian.
And Mr. Thompson.
And Mr. Thompson.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we've got a little PowerPoint thing, but it's going to be real quick because a picture is worth 1,000 words, so we'll eliminate thousands of words this way. Basically, I'm going to give you a little background and history on the project. Dave's going to walk through the project so you know exactly what it is that we're going to be building. Garrow's going to talk directly about the need for the project, and then we'll make our recommendation. So this has been a project, the Deerfield sidewalk from Putnam to the Circle. Has a long, long history with the town. It started back in 1989 when a resident complained that they had to cross the street several times going to the library from their home. So there was a lot of discussion about installing mid-block crosswalks and the inaccessibility of the street. So that was referred to the Sidewalk Committee, and it has been a longstanding priority of the Sidewalk Committee, starting in 1990 when it was their 5th priority project. In 2003, it was put in the long-term 10-year capital program, and in 2005, the design and study of the location was funded by the town. There was a skip in funding in 2006 because they were still working out the design details. We came back in 2007 for the funding of the sidewalk. At that point, the condition was placed on, and it had 2 parts to the condition. One was they wanted to verify the costs of the project, and the second one was demonstrate the need for the project. So we actually, because we had finished the design when the budget was going through, we bid the project. We have bids on the project. It's well within the budgeted amount, and so there really is no question about the cost of the project meeting the budget. So we're mainly here to address the need for the project tonight. We've gone through kind of a research, and this is sort of the beginning of the process to talk about sidewalks more broadly. I know I committed to you at the budget time that I would come back in September, and we would have a more detailed conversation about where do sidewalks fit in the long-term capital program, and I owe you that discussion, and we're developing that. But as a part of developing that, we've been looking for, are there warrants, are there numbers, are there any kind of recognized conditions for putting those in? And basically, we've found no numeric kind of criteria. Most of the information we found requires judgment. The Federal Highway Administration recommends that you have sidewalks on both sides of arterial streets. Deerfield Sidewalk has been a long-term priority of the Selectmen's Pedestrian Committee. And there's a lot of support in the Plan of Conservation and Development, recognizing, the need for providing safe pedestrian access, and that relates to several different criteria. Not only safety of the pedestrian, which is fairly obvious, but secondly, that it encourages people to not use a single occupant vehicle. It's more a friendly environment to encourage people to walk within the community. And one of the reasons I wanted to point out the Plan of Conservation and Development is I think that's the document where if you want to deal with, what is the town trying to accomplish with pedestrian activity, probably needs to be integrated into the Plan of Conservation and Development, because there you're dealing with not just safety and warrants, you're dealing with the quality of life in the community. So I think it's a good conversation to have this year with the Plan of Conservation and Development to sort of see where this program fits into the town's long-term vision. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave Thompson. He'll walk you through the project.
Thank you, Lloyd. We're going to go very quickly here, as Lloyd promised. Just walk through this description. I think most of you are familiar with this sidewalk. We're going to talk about the existing conditions, the problem areas, and some of the alternates we looked at. We did look at both sides of this road as potential candidates for a continuous sidewalk, and we ended up recommending the west side, so we're going to talk about the proposed construction also. Our graphic here with color codes shows very quickly where we are today. Again, I think most of you know we have an existing sidewalk on our easterly side that terminates about mid-block. We also have an existing sidewalk on the westerly side, which is going to be overlaid. It's in fairly good condition. And what we propose to do in the green is build a new sidewalk.
Dave, can you talk into the mic?
No, sorry, got away from it. Stay right here. We also have an existing sidewalk down on the westerly side coming off of Putnam Avenue for a short distance up to number 45. That's where we'll be starting our new construction up to Bob Dustin's property, his driveway. Some of the the areas that we've worked hard on and struggled with, of course, the mid-block crossing. Daryl's going to speak to that in more detail. This is something that was put into as a gap filler not too many years ago. It does have site constraints, and it is problematic as far as design is concerned. We see that as a problem area. Carol's going to speak to that in more detail. On the northern part of the sidewalk, we have a crosswalk which has very poor sight distance for both sides. We plan to be able to improve that to a satisfactory level. We're going to readjust that crosswalk to the south and clear the sight lines out, that problems that exist today. With that, we'll go to the slides, and I'm just going to walk you up the street so you can see where our new construction is going to go. We'll be starting again, as I mentioned, at the end of the existing sidewalk on the west side. We're going to work our way up to this part of the, I believe that's Deerfield Lane, the intersection. Next slide, Sean. This is kind of a tight area. We want a 7-foot shelf here. We like these sidewalks on roads with this much volume. Have a 3-foot grass strip. We're going to be able to fit that in here comfortably. The next slide will show you that we have a little more problem here. We need a retaining wall, a very short one, maybe 4 feet, 5 feet. We've worked with Bob Dustin, who's going to give us a temporary work easement. We do have to clear vegetation on his property. We do not need a permanent easement here. Next slide takes us up to the crosswalk, mid-block, that we will be talking some more about. And then we've matched up, and this is actually looking from the west to the east on that mid-block, looking east to west. And there's one slide here. Keep going, Sean. There's a limited sight distance, particularly here, looking south on the westerly side of that mid-block crosswalk. Very limited sight distance for the speeds and the volume of traffic we have on this road, particularly for what we call the vulnerable population. If you have children, elderly, or any handicapped people crossing here, it's hazardous for them. Going back up the street, we have an existing sidewalk, which again is in pretty good condition. We're going to maintain this with an overlay. It's in a little poorer condition as we get up. Next slide. This is Grove Lane. We've got a crosswalk there. And as we get up toward the end, we've got some problem areas that we've got to work on. We're going to salvage this. It's got a good base. We just overlay it. It'll look brand new. We get up to the end. We have the crosswalk that we told you, I mentioned before, we're going to have to enhance. Presently crosses here. The last slide will show you where the site problems are, which we plan to clear out. We're going to move the crosswalk up, clear all the vegetation out, clear the embankments down, and provide about 200-foot sight distance here, which we feel will be adequate for this area. I mentioned that we looked at 2 alternates. The biggest problem with the easterly side, which was our first choice, was the rock that we ran into at number 71 Deerfield. That was found to be prohibitive, too close to the property owner's home, too much money. And therefore, we went to the west side. The west side actually turns out to have some advantages in that it serves as a neighborhood to the west, where there's close to 20 homes that can access now a complete continuous sidewalk on Deerfield that they can't access now. So that's it. I'm going to turn over to Gerald.
Good evening. I was asked to look at the mid-block crossing and the safety concerns associated with 2 discontinuous sections of sidewalk and a pedestrian faced with a dilemma to try to cross to the other side, from one side to the other, because the sidewalk doesn't continue. And this is located on what we call a crest vertical curve on a bend in the road. It's the worst condition you could have. Mid-block crossings are a problem in itself because drivers don't expect pedestrians. It's driver expectancy. The speeds on Deerfield Drive, we've estimated to be in the 40-mile-per-hour range. Deerfield Drive serves Glenville Road, Brown Hill Road, and Lake Avenue. Truck traffic is on the higher side. All the construction equipment, tanker trucks, lawn equipment, everything is moving up and down that section of roadway. When we were there, we took pictures and we had a problem with the size and the speed of the traffic. So a pedestrian has 2 choices: to try to cross at this location or walk along the shoulder. Both choices are not good. We measured sight distance, pedestrian sight distance from each side of the mid-block crossing. We found 215 feet from one side of the street is our low number, and 265 from the other side. AASHTO recommends the minimum safe stopping distance to be 305 feet for a speed of 40 miles per hour when you do design. And you can see we're not in that range at all. So there are inherent problems with not having a continuous sidewalk, at least on one side. Federal Highway recommends for this type of road, you have it on both sides, as Lloyd had said, you have it on both sides of the road. You must have a continuous sidewalk on one side because pedestrians need that safety. I've stopped for people crossing there. I've stopped for them, and not on one occasion, on a number of occasions, because I know the crossing's there, but I'm the traffic engineer. Others don't know it's there. They're just they're pacing with the rest of the traffic. It's doing, as I said, 40, 45 miles per hour. I think I've covered everything as far as the slides. You can see there that Federal Highway and New York State say there are no numbers, no guidelines, but they recommend professional judgment be used in a case with locating sidewalks.
Questions start with Mr. Walko.
I just have a question on the sight distances. I thought I heard you say that you need 305 feet, but then when Mr. Thompson was up, he said that the reconfiguration of the crosswalk at the circle, you were going to redesign it and only obtain 220 feet. Did I hear everyone correctly?
I think you did. I might have said that we can obtain the 300 feet. We could probably obtain 350. It's just a matter of how much of that side slope, which is only about 4 feet high, we're just going to chop out. We'll just go back to where we get a satisfactory sight distance. That's all doable on that side. There's nothing that prevents that. The curvature fits that.
So you anticipate obtaining the 300 feet as opposed to the 200 or 220?
We'll maximize it, and we will get up to Garrow's recommendation. I'm certain we can do that.
Mr. Simon?
Yeah, could you go back to the slide so I can see where the crosswalk's going to be and it's going to be 300 feet south of the Lake Avenue Circle? That's the part that I don't quite understand.
That's just below the Lake Avenue Circle.
South.
Yeah. Can we see the last slide again, Larry?
I'd like to see on one of your slides, how is it going to be 300 feet south of the Lake Avenue Circle?
No, no. No, I said that's the sight distance we'll get. We go back to the map.
The map.
We're going to move it about 40 feet, and from there, we almost have an unlimited sight distance.
From the people going north?
From people going north.
So if people are coming off the Lake Avenue Circle, they'll be able to see the person also?
They'll also have almost that. You can see.
And it's not going to back traffic up in the Lake Avenue Circle?
No.
Because?
Because they're coming to us, it's supposed to be slowing down for the circle. It's supposed to be slowing down going through the circle.
I'm sorry, so you're moving it north?
No,
Moving it
we're
south.
moving it south by about 30 feet.
Now, they're not slowing down for anything. There's no reason for them to slow down there.
See the small piece of sidewalk, Ed? Yeah, we'll move it about 30 feet. And that's an optimal location. It's not that far away from the rotary. People do expect them at the rotaries. Ideally, we would have it closer to the rotary, but we have a curve here, and it just doesn't give us the sight distances. So the alternate is to move it further away. But it will be acceptable in terms of sight
And you
distance.
can see it from the rotary?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
They see that. They see that now. The other way.
Right, it's the curve.
It's the northbound. They can't see because of the brush.
Mr. Stone, you had a question?
You probably covered this before, but what is the posted speed limit in the area now?
Posted speed limit is 25. But they're not doing 25.
Right.
40.
So I gather.
I can't. If they were doing 25, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
they're not doing 25. And 25 is an inappropriate speed for this classification of road.
I see at the rear of the room a representative of Greenwich's finest. I'm just wondering, would this be worthy of comment? Well, I mean, we seem to have, you talked about observing traffic going in the mid-40s.
40, 45.
What other, Mr. Mason, do you have a question?
Two questions.
I understand.
My first question is the sidewalk on the, what I would call the east side. Are we going to abandon that, or are we going to still maintain that in our future years going forward? Because we're going to have a continuous sidewalk on the west side, so are we going to be budgeting for refurbishment, replacement? That would be my first question, what we're going to do with that sidewalk. My second question is, in any of the proposed new areas, are we making any improvements on any property owner's land as an agreement to this deal?
I'll answer the first one, Mike, first. This sidewalk we plan to leave in place. It services these 3 properties, and actually 4 properties. There's quite a bit of room, as you can see from the GIS map, for these properties to be developed in the future. I don't think there's anything that prevents that I know of anyway. So obviously we need to service that side. As mentioned earlier, you really should have sidewalks on an arterial road like this on both sides. But we can't get past that rock, at least not as a practical matter, not in terms of cost, nor in terms of the potential damage to this property, which is only 15 feet from the property line. And the property line is only about 3 feet off the edge of the road. So we just have to give up on that issue. Doesn't mean it couldn't be done sometime in the future if that house was to be rebuilt. There's potential. We feel we need to leave this sidewalk. I believe Garrow would agree with me. We definitely plan to get rid of the mid-block crosswalk. Yes, that's a given. And it might be appropriate to have some kind of a warning sign down here by the library to make sure new people who are walking this area know that this sidewalk dead ends.
But it's still a town sidewalk. The property owners still have the liability for keeping it clear, and so we still have the complete liability and financial risk on that sidewalk going forward in the future.
Yes.
Question number 2.
The only improvements that I recall, we did agree to relocate bushes at the property just north of number 4, number 8, taking out some bushes that typically we replace for people who pass back on the property. Probably have to give them some new bushes there. They're just shrubs. We also have...
You mentioned a retaining wall.
Oh, on the retaining wall. On Bob Dustin's property, the retaining wall is extensive, and the excavation to build the wall is extensive. There's numerous trees that have to come down behind that future wall.
Be relocated or eliminated?
No, they're the big pine trees that you see there. They have to come down. So those would be taken down. All of the landscaping, Bob and his wife have agreed to relocate themselves. We're going to just give them a safe limit of excavation line. They're going to move everything else back.
And this is consistent with our Safe Roads program. This is what we would do on other sidewalk programs?
Yeah, these trees are part of the construction the way we see it. I think they're, although they're on private property, they're definitely not what you call declining trees, but they're certainly not healthy trees, and they're very tall. I mean, if they fell on the road, we'd have them. We can't build a wall on the property. We'll just be damaging the root systems, and then we bought into the trees anyway because of their proximity to the wall. And that's the answer to your question. We have no other agreements. Bob has given us the right to work on his property. There's no other monetary exchanges. I can speak for him in saying he has children. He wants this side.
But in growing up just off the top of that slide, I mean, that's where you change the privacy and the noise on the property dramatically.
What about the trees?
It's a whole part
I think
of the
he's lost.
streetscape.
I think he's lost a few. I can't say that with certainty.
I'm just looking at it from this board's perspective. I don't want this sidewalk to have other sidewalk projects come back and say, well, you've set a precedence by when you've gone through a sidewalk, you've done the following, and
No, we don't feel it's a favor in any way. I mean, we think the trees are in our way, and we think the trees would be a liability if we left them there.
Mrs. Tarkington?
Yes, I have, I guess, 2 or 3 different questions. I guess the first was to follow on to Mr. Hubb's point that a picture says 1,000 words. I find it interesting that in 12 days, there were no pictures of any walkers or pedestrians or people walking their dogs or going to school or whatever along in any of those pictures. I think the second point is if someone could tell me what school it is that people walk to from there. You said that Safe Routes walking to school. I was just curious what the school is that they're walking to there. I think it's probably Julian Curtis.
I didn't hear you.
It seems to be a distance to walk. I think that little kids are less apt to walk from that busy area to school. I have another question.
I think was that a reference to the
Safe routes to school, walking to
OCD?
school.
This is not a safe routes to school. It's just a sidewalk project.
Oh, this isn't a safe route.
So
I misunderstood
it falls more in the category of it serves the central business district, the library, shopping centers, a lot of that type.
Okay. And then I guess one of the questions that I asked at the Budget Committee meeting was the quality of the traffic and the levels of traffic. What does putting that sidewalk, that now becomes a more defined sidewalk, just off of the Lake Avenue Circle, what does that do to the quality of the traffic, how it gets graded? Does it go from a C to a D? I mean, I can't imagine spinning around that circle, which I have to use now because North Street is so crowded that this is the way I come to town. I come from North Street over. And, you know, people are just spinning around there at incredible speeds. And to spin off that, and then, and you have to do it because you're being forced, and then to head south past that sidewalk could be terrifying because people are going to be spinning behind you around that circle, and you've got to get off of there fast. I don't know how that's going to be accomplished as a driver, but I was serious when I asked the question about the quality of the traffic, and does this change the quality level of the traffic? I asked that question at the Budget Committee meeting.
I'm not sure what you mean by the quality of the traffic, if you're talking about the level of service.
Yeah, C to F or whatever it is called.
Service,
right, level of service. I'm not a engineer.
The quality, it's terrible quality traffic. I don't it's not a great place to be walking, I can tell you that. But the level of service generally would not be affected by this type, and if I'm wrong, Gary will correct me. But basically, it's just a safety issue. So the only time anybody would have to slow down is if there was a pedestrian present that wanted to cross the street, and at that point we would hope they would slow down, or the pedestrian will have to look for a gap, and that's not going to be easy whether we do this project or not. That's going to be a concern.
You know what, the one school that comes to mind, I don't know if it's within the parameters, is the private school at the Westchester Fairfield Hebrew Academy. Or at the Japanese school site. I mean, those children range into the middle school.
They have asked to have their sidewalk.
No, but I'm saying in terms of they could potentially be walking, they're not, it goes into the middle school grades, just came to mind. Mr. Crumick.
Since I live in this neighborhood and actually walk this sidewalk, I would ask Leslie and everyone else using this as a cut-through to slow down a little bit. But I can tell you, and that also is doubly true for Perry Ridge Road, but I can tell you, as someone that does walk this, that there is no, right now, safe crosswalk for crossing the Lake Avenue Circle, and the improvement of that crosswalk that's part of this plan is long overdue. And there are people that walk that, people from the neighborhood, people from the hospital. The library is a big attractor of traffic. Also, there's a shopping center. There are medical offices. So, you know, this is a traveled portion, and now people do have to crisscross back and forth and take their lives in their hands. I hadn't, frankly, realized how dangerous the mid-street crosswalk is, I would usually cross right there, and after our Budget Committee meeting, I went back thinking about it and looking at it from traffic from the Lake Avenue Circle, and it does come up very rapidly. I was familiar, believe it or not, that one crosswalk that's identified for improvement here is, in my experience, the best way to cross the Lake Avenue Circle. You really take your hands, your life in your hands when you cross in the middle of the Lake Avenue Circle, because drivers seem to be confused going around crosswalks and they are going around circles, and they don't seem to understand the word yield. It seems to be some drivers just don't have that in their vocabulary. And again, I say that as someone who very frequently crosses around the roundabout on Lafayette and also crosses as a pedestrian the Lake Avenue Circle. So I think this is a needed, definitely a needed improvement, and I support it.
Mr. Finger.
I have several questions. Since one of the conditions was for you to explain to us the need for the sidewalk, could you please, again, explain the need for the sidewalk? I mean, I've seen the pictures. You've done a very good job of describing what you're going to do, and I, that's fine. But
yeah, I think one of the things we indicated that there seems to be a desire to have a number. You got 27 pedestrians, that warrants a sidewalk. That justifies a need. There is nothing like that. We tried to demonstrate, that we researched the Federal Highway Administration, we researched New York State. Everybody says you have to exercise judgment. The Federal Highway Administration defaults to this type of road should have sidewalks on both sides of the street, and I would actually support that. I don't think we should give up on getting a sidewalk on the east side of the street, and I think that's where it ties into the plan of conservation and development. Where I come from, the other end of the country, you put in sidewalks unless you got a reason not to. It's the inverse question, and that's generally the policy, and every property owner is required to install the sidewalk. It's their responsibility to do that. Now, they don't have a lot of snow to shovel off of those sidewalks, so that seems to be a huge difference here. But, that's kind of a perspective, and you get that perspective in a lot of these policies, that if you have an urbanized area where you have a lot of traffic, you've got 12 to 14,000 cars on here, they're at high speed. This serves the downtown, it serves the library. The sidewalks are discontinuous, you have to cross the sidewalk at a dangerous, you have basically a termination of a sidewalk, you cross them at mid-block, and then there's no place for them to go. So you can't really guide them. So what I would suggest, and we've talked about, and Carol may want to expand on it, is that you put some people that are actually going to downtown or the library should be crossing at the signal at Putnam, and then they've got a continuous sidewalk on the west side. So you could put a sign there that says cross at the intersection. A lot of times people won't do that. And I think handicapped people, elderly people will do that. They'll go back up and cross at the signal, and then they've got a continuous sidewalk on the west side. I think Dave indicated that there's a lot of neighborhoods on the west side that could take advantage of this. You got the site problems at the mid-block crosswalk, and we're going to improve the crossing at the circle. So that doesn't going to give you a number. I'm sorry, I can't give you a number, but those are the reasons we think this is needed.
I'm not looking for a number. Do you mind going back to the map, please? I can't read it from this distance, but the street that that connects from Brookside to Deerfield on the west side of Deerfield, is that Grove? Is that Grove Lane? Is there a sidewalk on Grove Lane? Currently, is there a sidewalk on Grove Lane? No. Is there a sidewalk on Brookside?
No, that's a high-volume road. Grove Lane is a very low-volume road.
Brookside is high volume. Deerfield is high volume.
Grove Lane is
No. You said Brookside is high volume, and I'm asking, Deerfield is also considered high volume. Do you have in your budget sidewalks for Grove and Brookside?
I don't have the sidewalk plan with me, but, there's a comprehensive list of sidewalks to be considered.
Okay, it would just seem to me that if you're advocating a sidewalk on Deerfield to serve the neighborhood is certainly encompassed by those homes those residences off of Grove Street and off of Brookside. And that was my point initially. I don't have a problem with sidewalks. I think sidewalks are great if they're used. But I think we need to be careful that just putting sidewalks in for the sake of putting sidewalks when this town has many capital needs and demands. We have existing infrastructure. I think we just need to be careful and a little bit more thoughtful as to where we're going to spend our money. And good timing, Arlene. I guess maybe you can answer the question. I just want people to realize that if we're going to spend money to put a sidewalk on Deerfield for the reasons you enumerated, then we should be prepared shortly thereafter to follow through in putting sidewalks in other high-volume roads that lead to or near shopping areas, hospitals, things of that sort. And this board should be aware that, that's probably going to come this way, and if we say no to the others, if I'm a resident, I'm going to say, well, why not my street?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think that's what you asked me to address in September, and we'll come back with a more comprehensive, and I do think, that's exactly the right question to ask. We need to figure out how this program fits in with all the other programs in the city, town.
Mr. Krummick.
The difference, of course, Bill, is there already is a sidewalk and crosswalks on this street. They are not safe, and the reason they're not safe is they're not continuous, and the crosswalk there are two crosswalks. One is a mid-street crosswalk that's not safe for the reasons that Garrow mentioned, and the other is a crosswalk at the Lake Avenue Circle, which has sightline problems, which they're going to resolve. So the difference between this and your hypothetical situation is there are sidewalks here, there are pedestrians here, there are crosswalks here, they're not safe. How can we make them safe? And God forbid we wait until there's a serious accident to come back and deal with an unsafe situation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Krummick. Mr. Finger.
If I may respond to that, I recognize that, Ed, and it should be, if people are going to use it, it should be safe. Once the sidewalk's there and we have a safe sidewalk, I think it's incumbent upon us to consider the other roads in the area to make sure they're safe, because now we've created a safe environment for pedestrians, and Arlene had mentioned at I guess it was the Budget Committee meeting, that you build it and they will come. We need to be prepared. If we go ahead and approve this and we build it, they will come. And that's the only point I want to make, that it doesn't necessarily stop with one sidewalk, excuse me.
Further comments? Mr. Simon?
I just want to follow up on the comment that Mr. Mason made, which I think was very good, that if you continue in existence the sidewalk on the east side, people are going to walk on that. They're going to get to the end. They're going to want to cross over, and you're going to be right back in the middle of the block because people aren't going to know that the sidewalk ends. And you're creating a potential liability for the town. I don't know that deserves, I'm looking for an answer, but I think that's something you should just consider.
Mr. Lash, would you like to comment?
I wasn't going to address that question, but I will. Some people are only walking the distance that sidewalk covers, and that's the end of their trip. And in fact, we looked for quite a while at the possibility of extending that sidewalk all the way down. And it's a complicated and much more expensive project than the one that's proposed, which is not to say someday it won't come back anyway. I want to talk to Mr. Finger's point. As some of you know, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, the town got interested in the Safe Routes to Schools program. And that program wasn't supposed to be about sidewalks, but it developed a sidewalk component. And when I came into office in 2003, I went to Arlene Lamazzo, who just walked in a minute ago, who at the time was the long-serving chair of the Pedestrian Safety Committee, which is a creature of the Board of Selectmen. It's not like some of the other committees. And I said to her, for a very long time, you and your committee have been looking at all the dangerous locations in town, and each year seeing if you can get the BET to put one sidewalk into the budget. And you pick your best sidewalk and hope for the best. And about half the time you get that, and about half the time you don't, and then it gets in the next year. So we weren't making much progress on sidewalks. And meantime, traffic was expanding, speeds of vehicles was increasing. One of the most common complaints that I get is about traffic and traffic congestion. And the police department, which does a survey of the community every year that survey shows that the number one issue is traffic. I think sometimes what the public would like us to do is put all the police cars out with radar, doing nothing but writing tickets, although I think they'd get ticked off if we actually did that. But if you look at the kind of the mail we get, that is what they seem to be communicating, and forget about making calls to crime scenes, just slow the traffic down. So I asked Arlene and the committee to undertake a comprehensive review of the need for sidewalks in areas where we know we have concentrations of people who walk, around schools, in business districts, in places like this, which is not quite either one of those, but it's a place that attracts walkers. And they then spent 3 years producing 3 or 4 binders of very detailed information, which they then, working with Commissioner Hubbs, prioritized using a scoring system that they developed for that purpose. And that now has been turned over to the Public Works Department, and they're in the process of trying to develop a comprehensive 10 or 15-year plan for building out sidewalks. So you're exactly right. You're going to see, as we kind of get past this lump of public school projects, you're going to begin to see sidewalk projects building up. And that will no doubt create the kinds of conversation that you were just alluding to. The one thing we know from the Safe Routes experience is that some people don't want these projects, primarily because they don't want to be responsible for keeping the sidewalks cleaned. They would rather we had the pedestrian safety risk, which doesn't occur to them, than have to shovel a sidewalk. And we've had quite a lot of conversation about Mallard Drive this year. Nevertheless, the Public Works Department will begin to develop that plan. It will take them, I would guess, 2 or 3 years to sort of fully flesh out the plan, which is not the same as engineering all the sidewalks, and then a longer period of time to build the sidewalks. Because when you start to do a sidewalk, you typically have to rethink the infrastructure which is adjacent to the road or under the ground adjacent to the road, stormwater drains and things like that. So yes, you're going to be seeing quite a lot more of that.
Thank you, Mr. Lash. Further comments on this? If not, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carries. Thank you. PW 12.
Next item on the agenda is a DPW request for additional appropriation, $28,900. This was, I'll move it first.
Moved by Mr. Walko, seconded by Mr. Simon.
Chairman, if I may, the Budget Committee decided to put this on as a non-routine item solely for the purpose of explaining why we were in favor of this additional appropriation. Obviously, it's outside of the CIP process. However, we believe as a committee it falls within the exception to that, which is when the request came from the department for a van, there was actually a request for 2 vans. There was a communication gap between the requesting department and the Department of Finance, and therefore it was an oversight that we are correcting now.
Great. Comments on this item? Not all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. SE 19, First Selectman, 15,000.
I'll allow the Law Committee to take this up. This does not come before the Budget Committee.
Ms. Barton, do you want to?
This is a settlement of a litigation that's been pending for a long time, brought by a former employee of the town. The law committee voted 2-0 to approve the settlement.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Kremick. Any discussion on it?
For the record, my understanding is that this is the procedure that we've put in place in conversations between the Budget Committee and the Law Committee, that appropriations of this nature and this amount would go before the Law Committee and then go straight to the BET.
Right.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, yes, that's the way we're doing these in the future, so, again.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Moving to item number 3, the assessor's report. We have with us Mr. Gortney, Town Assessor, and Mr. Shipman, Assistant Assessor.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. We did get the file transferred to the tax collector so that the tax bills can be processed. You'll notice on the second page of my report that we have processed and approved 602 elderly tax credits at a cost to the town of $584,864. We've had a few withdrawals on our litigation, and we had another resale of 55 Railroad Avenue at a record high price of $1,172 per square foot. The important item on the agenda I'd like to just take a minute and discuss with you. I met this afternoon with Peter Tessie and Leslie and Nancy at 12:30 to review the revaluation assistance that we have a request for a proposal out on. We discussed the upcoming revaluation, and it's going to have to be completed within a period of 4 or 5 years since the 2005 revaluation was completed, which means that it would have to be complete in the next 2 or 3 years from this date. We have an important need to redefine the neighborhoods and to tie them into zoning. We have an important need, I think, to meet with all the town departments, the planning, zoning, conservation, building departments, and so forth. And we need to do a lot of work on screening and processing the sales. So we're anxious to get going on the project, and we did a screening. We reviewed the companies in terms of their experience, their success, their management abilities, and their price. And we found clearly that there was one company that we rated the highest, and they also were willing to provide the services at the lowest cost, and that was Total Valuation Services, which are located in Fairfield and Waterbury, Connecticut. I will be contracting with Total Revaluation Services to provide the needed assistance. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
Ted, I would just, again, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. I think it was a very fruitful discussion, and it looks like you're on the right track, moving in the right direction. Other comments? Any other items on the report that members have questions about? If not, is there a motion to accept the assessor's report?
I so move.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, seconded by Ms. Barton. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, liaison reports. Mr. Stone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Audit Committee met on the 15th of June. Initially, we received the presentation of limited scope audit concerning NSF checks and approved its distribution. I recommend that report to you. There will be follow-up action involving communication and procedures. We received an update on implementation of changes resulting from last year's payroll audit. Ron Lawley of the Office of the First Selectman indicated that progress is continuing concerning dealing with the findings of the audit. The committee will continue to monitor the progress and expect our next update at the September meeting. We reviewed the processes involved in the town's construction projects. Our focus was on those public school projects which are placed under the control of specially appointed building committees. In this connection, we were joined by Frank Mazza, who currently chairs 2 such committees. He shared with us his observations, particularly relating to committee composition, as well as contract drafting and approval thereof. The Audit Committee will attempt to make suggestions to this board based on such comments and the associated Q&A. Finally, the Audit Committee reviewed the status of proposed changes to the town's purchasing process. In that connection, we were joined by the Director of Purchasing, Joan Sullivan, who explained the reasoning behind limiting the rollout of the background information requests. She agreed to update us in July concerning the experience of the trial and her department's plans going forward in this connection. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the Audit Committee report. In connection with the Retirement Board, just simply say the Retirement Board took no action of note at their meeting of May 31st.
Great,
thank you.
Are there other committee and liaison reports? Mr. Walco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. You should have received in your packet a packet of documents from the town attorney's office pertaining to the OPEB and the creation of an OPEB trust. The OPEB ad hoc committee met the same night as the BET budget committee meeting. We have scheduled a meeting for, again, the same night as the BET budget committee meeting, which is July 10th at 5:30, pending the unavailability of any members of the OPEB ad hoc committee. We did not have 2 of our members present at the last meeting, and therefore I think it's incumbent that we have everybody there for our next meeting. So that'll be at 5:30 if the members of the OPEB ad hoc committee meeting committee can get back to me to tell me if they're available that evening. And if they are, we would ask for comments, especially from the ad hoc OPEB committee members, as to the documents that were provided. We will be looking to, at the July meeting, make a recommendation to the BET so that we can proceed accordingly and hope to have a definitive recommendation to make to the full BET in July.
Thank you. Mrs. Tarkington, you had a report?
Yes. The June 14 Human Resources Committee meeting was attended by all members, Ms. Cass and Mr. Geiger. Ms. Cass provided an update on the MC pay plan study being prepared by the Hay Group. Substantial information has been shared with Hay, and additional questionnaire information is being collected from the senior managers in town. Ms. Cass reviewed the monthly vacancy and reclassification reports. She reported on training, which is currently focused on sexual harassment and hostile work environment training. The committee discussed the HR Department Charter Amendment, particularly as it carves out the HR Department's responsibility for the Board of Education managerial and confidential staff. Finally, the committee discussed the general wage increase, known as the GWI, of 3.25%, and I think the supporting information is in your package, recommended for the MC employees effective July 1. The committee unanimously supports this increase and passed a resolution to that effect. I'd also add that there was discussion about the BOE MC employees, and it was the sentiment of the committee that the BOE should also provide pay increases that comply with the standards of the town and shouldn't be greater than that of other town employees in similar positions. Thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other committee and liaison reports? If not, we'll proceed to the Controller's report. We received it. Mr. Minarski is recuperating from surgery. So would you want to take action on accepting it, or would you prefer to defer that? Is there a motion to I thought there was a report.
No.
There was not one.
I suggest we defer it.
I thought we had one.
We did get a nice thank you note.
So we don't have a report. So moving forward, number 6, the treasurer's report. Mr. Norton, you want to move?
Yes, before I move the treasury report, I'd like to review it briefly. The report we have, I have an updated report. On the general fund, the amount that's shown there, the $55,207,000, does include the proceeds from, it includes in 2 places, but it includes the proceeds from the sale of the bonds which were done last month, the $8.6 million for Tuckman and the $2.5 million for was put into the capital and reserve account. I have revised or updated figures as of last Friday, in which combined general fund and the reserve for capital has $47,037,000 in it, and that doesn't also include the $8.6 million for Tuckman, which will, I believe, unless I'm incorrect, that will be paid by the end of the year.
Supposedly the sale date's very, very close.
So that our present balance in the operating accounts, which include the reserve for capital, is currently $47,037,000. Having made those comments, I'll move the treasurer's report.
Is there a second?
So moved.
Mr. Walko, discussion? All in favor of approval?
Aye.
Approval of minutes for the regular meeting of May 21st, 2007. I know Ms. Rutgers has sent us some minor modification right through email today.
Yes, I sent it by email, and there's a hard copy
on
on your
our
desk with the 2 changes that I indicated, which I can read to you if you want me to.
Oh, no, it's not necessary. I think everyone's comfortable with what you propose. So moved by Mr. Walko. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Simon. All in favor?
Aye.
For the special meeting on May 29th.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Walko. Second by Mr. Mason. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Barton, Tessie, Himes. Okay. Under item number 8, officers' report. Last month, after last month's meeting, Mr. Byrne, Mr. Lash, and I had the privilege of meeting with John Chadwick. John Chadwick is one of the 2 citizen representatives to the Retirement Board. Under the town charter, the BET chair and the first selectman and RTM moderator appoint these individuals. Mr. Chadwick was up for reappointment to a 4-year term. He filled the unexpired term of Alan Breed. Mr. Chadwick has performed admirably on the board. He comes to the board with a strong knowledge of investments, having worked in his last position for Bessemer Trust. The feedback I received from him from people who have seen him in operation have been positive. So he was unanimously reappointed for the 4-year period. Another item is that the RTM is looking at the capital improvement process and linkage to it with the plan of conservation and development. The moderator of the RTM has asked Josh Brown to chair this effort. Josh is the former chairman of the RTM Finance Committee. He sent me an email today informing me that their committee is meeting this Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. in the Mazza Room, and he would like to welcome the members of the BET to come before the committee and share their thoughts. As he says in his email communication, my committee is looking at improvements to the CIP process to better integrate, align, link it with the POCD. We have interviewed members of the PNC, the GLWV, Greenwich League of Women Voters, Selectman's Office in an effort to explore and identify ideas. we were very interested in hearing the thoughts of the BET on this. So that's 7:30 p.m. in the Mazza Room this Wednesday evening. And on another note, I received a letter from Mrs. Zambrowski that effective after the July meeting, you'll be resigning your position as recording secretary of the board due to the fact you're taking a full-time, part-time position. So unfortunately, we're sad to lose your services. You've done an exemplary job for us, and appreciate it. So Roland will be looking again to fill that, although we also have received word that the position in the finance department that was considered managerial and confidential class was petitioned by the GMEA for representation. They want that position. There's been a whole process by which Al-Kava has gone through to retain that position outside of the union. Given the nature of the work, the fact that it doesn't handle as much confidential matter as defined for keeping it that way, we did not win the argument in that case. So right now, we will be, essentially Peter and you will be choosing from a list of candidates who can either transfer in or apply for the position. And that position may in fact be able to serve us in terms of taking minutes. So, and that's all I have under the officer's report. Mr. Stone, do you have anything?
No, nothing to report.
Ms. Rutgers?
No.
Any under old business? New business, we have the annual approval of the change in the general wage increase for MC managerial confidential employees for the fiscal year 7/107 through June 30/08 per our managerial confidential class compensation plan. For the purpose of moving this, I call upon Mrs. Tarkington, the chairman of the Human Resources Committee.
The Human Resources Committee moves that the BET approve the general wage increase of 3.25% recommended for the MC employees for fiscal year 2007-2008.
Second.
It's moved by Mrs. Tarkington, seconded by Ms. Rutgers. Any discussion? Mr. Norton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. If I read this report that was handed out tonight, I think it differs from that which we received in the Human Resources Committee, because I thought that report included a blank item for the M&C employees of the Board of Education. That being the case, this member of the Board of Estimate would strongly recommend to the Board of Education that they also grant a general wage increase to the M&C employees commensurate with that which we're recommending for the other town employees.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Mr. Gugger, do you have a comment on that? That hasn't been, my recollection is that hasn't been the past practice.
Basically, we are approving the town employees, town MCs on that grid. We got rid of
If I understand you correctly, Mr. Norton, you want us to communicate to the BOE that they should adhere to the same level of increase we're giving the town.
Well, at least I do personally, yes.
I'll certainly pass that along. Any other comments on it?
You know, as I reported, there certainly was discussion in the HR committee meeting, and I think most members of the committee, if not all, felt there should be a commonality of the increase. But we did not include that in our resolution. It was a discussion item.
Great. Any further comments on this? If not, all in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Carries. And then finally, there was a distribution of proposed. They should have said calendar, and Roland, thank you for pulling this together. It was just meant for people to have a chance to begin to think about the meetings for next year. Hopefully you've all received this. It was handed out. Did you make copies for everyone? So we will approve this in July, but it's often given in June so members can review it. One of the things you might want to consider is we did make adjustments last year to our start time from 7 to 6:30. I know there were some divergent points of view about it. I mean, this is the opportunity for people, if they want to propose something different, they're certainly welcome to. Mr. Simon?
I just want to point out, I know you said you approved it in July, you checked with town clerk, and the RTM isn't setting theirs until September, so there might be some changes after that.
I was going to say, most of the dates you have for the RTM meeting, I don't think are correct. They certainly don't meet on Tuesdays ever. And
Sure they do if there's a holiday.
I think they generally meet the following Monday.
No, there's been cases, but the point being, we wanted to get started. In our process, we've always done it in July, but if we want to be certain, I could talk to Tom Byrne and see. I mean, I don't think they've deviated from, what is it, the second Monday of the month. But this is just to get people thinking about it, so we don't.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
the RTM normally meets on a Tuesday in January.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's something just to think about. I mean, you can get your comments rolling into you. Who should people direct any changes to you so that we can corral them? Okay.
Are we also going to add the public hearing dates to this in July? Or are we going to wait longer?
No, we'd like to set those dates when we set the calendar. I believe that's what was on last year's. It's usually driven by what the Budget Committee does.
Okay.
So, is there any other business to come before the meeting? If not, is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Mr. Norton, seconded by Mr. Finger, 9:08. Thank you.